When I died the first time, the strange thing was that I wasn't angry. I should have been. A woman who gives 20 years of her life to a man, raises his children, cooks for his parents, sacrifices her own ambitions so he can climb the ladder of prestige. Such a woman should die full of resentment. But as I lay in that hospital bed with the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoing through the dim room, what I felt instead was an overwhelming numbness. My body was failing slowly, quietly, the doctors already speaking in careful euphemisms in the hallway. But the true cause of my death had never been illness. It had been erosion. Year after year of being treated as something replaceable, something convenient, something that existed only to maintain the smooth functioning of other people's lives. My husband Julian Hartley had once been charming, thoughtful even, the kind of young lecturer whose students adored him, and whose future seemed bright enough to light the whole room. I had loved him so fiercely that I convinced myself every sacrifice was temporary. When his parents moved in and criticized everything I did, I told myself it was just family adjustment. When Julian began staying later at the university, I told myself success demanded long hours. When the quiet distance between us turned into cold indifference, I told myself marriages naturally changed over time. By the time the truth finally surfaced, his affair with a brilliant young researcher in his department, it barely felt like betrayal anymore. It felt inevitable. The humiliation of it spread through the campus like wildfire, whispered behind office doors and across faculty dinners. Julian didn't even bother denying it. One night he simply stood in the living room with that same calm academic tone he used when delivering lectures, and told me we were no longer intellectually compatible. I remember staring at him across the dinner table we had shared for nearly 2 decades, realizing the man I had loved no longer saw me as human. I was simply an outdated version of his life. When my heart finally gave out years later, alone in a sterile hospital room, I thought the story had ended exactly the way it was meant to. Quietly, pathetically, like a book no one bothered finishing. But when I opened my eyes again, I was sitting at my own kitchen table. For several long seconds I simply stared at the steam rising from a bowl of soup in front of me, trying to understand why my hands looked younger, why my body felt lighter, why the apartment around me looked so painfully familiar. The calendar on the wall answered the question before my mind could fully process it. 10 years earlier. 10 entire years before the hospital room, before the humiliation, before Julian's academic rise and the affair that followed it. The realization hit me like ice water. My heart began racing, not with fear but with a strange electrifying awareness. I had been given something impossible, a second chance to live the same decade with full knowledge of how it ended. The memories came rushing back in relentless waves. The arguments with my in-laws about money. The moment my parents offered to help us buy a new apartment closer to Julian's university. The countless small humiliations that eventually turned into the life I died in. But as I sat there in that quiet kitchen with the afternoon sunlight pouring through the window, something about my reaction was different from what it had been the first time. In my previous life I had been soft, eager to keep the peace, constantly searching for ways to make everyone happy. That version of me had believed kindness alone could hold a marriage together. This time, however, the emotion settling inside my chest was not fear or desperation. It was curiosity. If I already knew the ending of the story, what would happen if I simply changed the script? The first opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. That evening during dinner, my parents brought up the same offer they had made in my previous life. They wanted to help us buy a larger apartment in a prestigious residential complex near the university. Back then, I had burst into grateful tears. Now I simply watched the reactions around the table with quiet attention. Julian's parents immediately leaned forward with poorly concealed excitement, their eyes gleaming like merchants who had just spotted a profitable investment. Julian himself smiled politely, though his gaze flickered briefly toward his father as if silently confirming an unspoken agreement. I knew exactly what that look meant. In my previous life, the apartment had been registered under Julian's name because it made sense for the husband to handle property matters. That decision eventually allowed him to control nearly every financial aspect of our lives. But this time, before anyone could speak, I set my chopsticks down calmly and said something that froze the entire room. "If we buy the apartment," I said casually, "it should be under Ava's name. Ava was our daughter, only 9 years old at the time, and the reaction was immediate. My mother-in-law's expression twisted as if she had bitten into something sour. A child owning property? She scoffed. What nonsense is that? Julian laughed softly, though there was a sharp edge beneath the sound. Marina, he said gently, using the same patient tone he used with students who asked foolish questions. Don't complicate things. It's just easier if the apartment is under my name. But instead of backing down the way I had before, I simply leaned back in my chair and studied him with a small smile. Why? I asked. The word hung in the air like a blade. For the first time since I had known him, Julian looked genuinely uncertain. The discussion that followed was far more tense than it had been in my previous life, but the final outcome ended up surprisingly similar. The apartment was registered under our son Daniel's name instead. It was a compromise Julian could tolerate because he still believed he controlled the family's future. But from that moment onward, something subtle shifted in the dynamics of our household. Instead of bending to every expectation the way I once had, I began quietly dismantling the systems that had trapped me before. I encouraged the children to spend more time with my parents, strengthening bonds that would later protect them from Julian's influence. I insisted on managing certain financial decisions myself. Most importantly, I began observing Julian more closely, not with the wounded devotion of a wife, but with the detached curiosity of someone studying a complex psychological experiment. What I discovered surprised me more than any betrayal ever could. The Julian Hartley I remembered from my previous life had seemed calculating and ambitious, a man willing to replace his wife the moment she stopped serving his intellectual image. But the Julian standing in front of me now was not quite the same person. Yes, he was ambitious. Yes, he enjoyed admiration and prestige. But there was also a restless dissatisfaction in him, something deeper than simple arrogance. As the months passed, I began noticing small details I had overlooked the first time around. The way he sometimes stared at old research notes late at night with visible frustration, the bitterness that crept into his voice when discussing academic politics, the occasional flash of vulnerability when he believed no one was watching. The real twist came 2 years later, when I finally discovered the identity of the woman who had once destroyed my marriage. In my previous life, she had been a brilliant young researcher named Evelyn Clark, confident, elegant, intellectually dazzling in ways I had always felt I could never match. I remembered how effortlessly she moved through academic circles, how naturally Julian gravitated toward her during faculty gatherings. Their affair had seemed almost inevitable. But in this second life, when I finally encountered Evelyn during a university event, something about the interaction felt wrong. She was certainly intelligent and confident, but the way she spoke to Julian carried none of the flirtatious intimacy I remembered. In fact, if anything, she seemed slightly uncomfortable around him. Over the following months I watched them carefully, waiting for the familiar pattern of emotional closeness to appear. It never did. Eventually, curiosity overcame me, and I approached Evelyn directly during a conference reception. What she told me that night changed everything I thought I knew about my past life. Julian once asked me out, she admitted awkwardly, swirling the wine in her glass. Years ago, I declined. I blinked, stunned. Declined? Evelyn shrugged with a faint smile. He's brilliant, but complicated. I could tell he was the kind of man who blamed everyone else when things didn't go his way. She paused, studying my expression carefully. Why do you ask? For the first time since my rebirth, I felt truly disoriented. If Evelyn had rejected him, then the affair I remembered from my previous life shouldn't have existed. And that meant something else must have happened in the timeline. I originally lived through something I had completely misunderstood. The truth finally revealed itself months later in a way I never could have predicted. One evening I returned home early from visiting my parents and found Julian sitting alone in the dark living room, staring at a stack of unopened letters from the university administration. When he noticed me standing in the doorway, his composure cracked in a way I had never seen before. The letters contained formal warnings. His research funding had been cut. His latest academic paper had been rejected by multiple journals. The prestigious promotion he had once chased so obsessively was slipping further and further out of reach. For years he had built his entire identity around the belief that he was destined for greatness. And now that illusion was collapsing piece by piece. "Do you know what it feels like?" he said quietly. "To realize you're not the person you thought you were?" The bitterness in his voice was suffocating. In that moment, I suddenly understood what had happened in my previous life. The affair hadn't been about love at all. It had been about failure. Julian had needed someone to blame for the gap between his expectations and reality. In that timeline, I had simply been the easiest target. But this time, the ending unfolded very differently. Instead of staying silent while his frustration turned into resentment, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I told him the truth. Not about the rebirth, he would never have believed that, but about everything else. About how I had spent years shrinking myself to fit into the narrow role he expected from a wife. About how the marriage we had built was slowly suffocating both of us. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. There were arguments, accusations, moments of raw honesty neither of us had ever allowed before. By the time the sun began rising outside the window, we both understood something that had been invisible during our first life together. The marriage wasn't failing because of betrayal. It was failing because we had built it on illusions about who we were supposed to be. 3 months later, we divorced quietly. No scandal, no screaming fights, no humiliating affairs. The strangest part came afterward. Instead of destroying each other, we simply went our separate ways. Julian left academia entirely and moved to another city to start a consulting business. The children stayed with me, but he visited regularly and maintained a surprisingly warm relationship with them. Sometimes, when I watch Ava and Daniel laughing with their grandfather in my parents' garden, while my mother hums softly in the kitchen, I think about the two versions of my life. In one timeline, my marriage ended in betrayal and humiliation. In the other, it ended in something far more unexpected: understanding. Being reborn didn't just change the events of my life. It changed the way I saw the people inside it. And sometimes, that difference alone is enough to rewrite the entire ending.